Hello everyone, my name is Ali Davey. I work in the Conservation Directorate at Historic Environment in Scotland. The area that I work in is mainly projects focused on promoting traditional skills and materials, and my particular area of interest is traditional architectural ironwork. Any of you that have watched the Welcome will recognise my face, so I'm back again. This is my second time recording this presentation, so hopefully it works. It works this time without any hiccups. So really I'm here just to give you a bit of an introduction into traditional architectural ironwork in Scotland. The iron founding industry was particularly important and particularly successful in Scotland in the 19th century, and that's the period I'll focus on. But I'm going to explain a little bit of the lead up to that period in this talk, and hopefully just show you some nice pretty pictures that help you maybe appreciate a part of our built heritage that maybe you don't notice all the time. So you might notice it a little bit more after this talk. Hopefully you will. So architectural cast ironwork that was mass produced in the 19th century is a very durable material. It's versatile, it's hard wearing, and as a result, loads of it still survives today, still doing its original job. It's a fantastic material and a very beautiful one in many cases. So it's all around us, from shop fronts to building facades and park benches, bus shelters, and all of these still doing the original job they were designed to do. It was also used for signage. It helped revolutionize how buildings worked. The ability to mass produce cast iron meant that rainwater goods could be applied to all of the mass building that was going on during the 19th century. And of course, the Victorians took great advantage of the versatility of the material to add decoration to all of their rainwater goods. So just remember to look up when you're walking along the streets to see if there are any nicely decorated gutters and hopper heads. Cast iron was also really popular for grave markers and grave railings. It offered an opportunity to provide a much more ornate memorial to a loved one, but at a much cheaper cost. It would have been cheaper to purchase something very, very ornate and decorative that was cheaper to produce than carving something individually in stone. And of course, domestic railings. In Ireland, where I'm from originally, we're lucky enough to still have huge swathes of our original 19th century railings. The UK was not quite so lucky, so very often what you see is stumps, but there are still pockets surviving. For anyone who's been to Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis, for example, you may have noticed all the original railings are still there. Similarly in places like Blairgowrie and up in Shetland too, so there are isolated pockets. And very thankfully as well, lots of railings are being reinstated these days too. Of course, lots of lovely ironwork in East Lothian. I had a very quick look on the Scottish Ironwork Foundation database. This is a charity that I'm a trustee of, and it is basically a searchable database. I have the link at the end of this talk, and it catalogues all of the ironwork that we know of that's found and made in Scotland. So I just had a quick search to see what I could find for East Lothian, and some really lovely examples came up, and you can go on there and have a look as well and see where all of these lovely examples are. The lovely water trough and lamp standard on the left hand side is now gone. It was originally in Tranent, but I understand there is an identical one still surviving in Durban of all places. So those Scottish ironworks got around. There are amazing examples surviving all around the world. So we'll skip back a bit of time back in history a bit, just to look at the beginnings of ironwork. I'm going to be talking about cast iron, but of course wrought iron is another form of iron. It's the bendy kind of iron, whereas cast iron is hard and doesn't bend. Wrought iron required lower temperatures to make. Technology didn't really advance until the late 18th century to enable people to mass produce cast iron, and that's really when it took off. Before then, wrought iron was really the material of choice because it was more affordable to make. So a prime example of 16th century ironwork are these wonderful yetts. They're basically window grills or door grills on Stirling Castle. And wrought iron at this time was really, it was expensive and it was used on high status buildings. So that was a typical use of it. Um, when the technology advanced, of course, you then get cast iron in the 19th century, and a few more really, really lovely examples, more from East Lothian. This wonderful fountain on the top left in Haddington. Of course, beautiful cast iron bridge parapets again in Haddington, and then a few other lovely examples from Aberlady and Dunbar. I see I've got my slides in disarray, so I'm jumping around a bit here, but hopefully they'll be back in order after this one. So we're back in time, back to the 17th century, when wrought iron was still the favoured material. It was still the most affordable one to make. Now, this guy Jean Tiju, who came to England in the 17th century, was the first person to create a catalogue of designs for wrought ironwork, and this was very influential in England. And you can still see examples of his work, for example, in the Victorian Albert Museum. Really, really superb craftsmanship. He was hugely influential in England, but interestingly, he really didn't impact on Scotland. Well, certainly the surviving ironwork from that period, the story that it tells is that he was not influential in Scotland. The Scottish blacksmiths and designers were definitely doing their own thing, which I'll show in the next slide. So Scottish designers were doing their own thing. Very distinctive style in the 17th century. All of these scrolls, the flowers, thistles. You can see the flat bar. But these wide sweeping scrolls were really typical of this period. And then down on the bottom, I can see my picture is obscuring part of that. That's Hopeton House on the bottom right. And you can see those flowers, those flower finials. They were pretty influenced by Flemish blacksmiths, and again, really typical of the type of work that was being done in Scotland at the time. And of course, the fabulous gates, which are really early, up on the top right-hand side at Panmure House. Really, really superb examples, and it's just incredible that these examples survive today and still tell us a really important story. So moving on, once you get to the 18th century, technology is starting to advance and people are finding new ways to smelt iron more cheaply. So St. Paul's Cathedral has one of the earliest sets of cast iron railings in the world. These date to 1714, and you can see just how chunky and massive these are. Extraordinary railings, and these were the earliest known examples. So back to technology, once you get to the start of the 18th century, foundries are trying to find new ways of fueling their furnaces in a more affordable way. They had been fueling their furnaces using charcoal, which was becoming increasingly expensive as woodland became more scarce. The woodland had been chopped down over the centuries for use for battleships, and then later for growing industry to fuel furnaces, whether it was for lime or iron. So charcoal had become really expensive. So Abraham Darby discovered a way of using coke, which is derived from coal much in the same way as charcoal is derived from timber. He found a way of using coal in the form of coke to fuel the furnaces, and this opened up the door to all of these foundries setting up shop, and it opened the door for an affordable way of smelting iron. So this was the beginnings really of the Industrial Revolution and the use and application of cast iron. His son, another Abraham Darby, went on to create the world's first ever iron bridge. You can still see it today in Iron Bridge in Shropshire, dating to 1779. It's a superb structure. It's really interesting to look at early structures like these because this was a really new application of the material in terms of structures. And designers were having to make things up as they go. So when you look at how this bridge is put together, they've really taken a lot of inspiration from carpentry techniques, for example. In terms of finesse, you start seeing a shift in the later 18th century. For example, the Adams brothers, so many of you will have heard of the famous designer Robert Adam. His brother was a partner in Karen Ironworks, which was one of the first large-scale industrial complexes and industrial iron foundries. So Robert Adam teamed up with his brother, and it was one of the first people to realize the full potential of cast iron, the full decorative potential. So you start seeing far more refined designs creeping in from this time. And of course, Robert Adam was realizing that he could, instead of having to individually carve timber mantle pieces or ornate timber features or features in stone, he was instead able to create something just as ornate but mass produce it in cast iron. So this was really a revolution in design and the application of cast iron to architecture. So moving on to the middle of the 19th century, this is when the founding industry really takes off in Scotland, and that was, again, we're back to technology and technological advancements. Up until the start of the 19th century, people weren't aware of ore deposits or fuel deposits that would allow them to use these deposits. At the start of the century, in 1801, there was a native type of iron ore was discovered, black band iron ore, and then in the 1830s, a technique that helped heat furnaces more economically by blowing hot air into them instead of having to use more fuel was discovered. And from that point onwards, the iron founding industry absolutely explodes in Scotland. So Walter Macfarlane was one of probably the most successful iron founders of his age in the 19th century. He was certainly leading the way in terms of mass producing architectural cast ironwork in the world. So he set up originally in Saracen Lane in Glasgow. The primary school there, for example, is still called Saracen Primary School. He outgrew the premises and then moved to Postle Park, where you can see the picture on the right hand side shows the enormous extent of his workshop. And he started off just producing simple sanitary ware, so soil pipes and downpipes, things like that. And he swiftly branched into more decorative, ornate castings, which really appealed to the Victorian sensibilities. And the top left shows a view of his showroom and the types of things that his firm were producing. And this was really, I suppose, the equivalent maybe of plastic today. Cast iron was seen as hygienic, portable, durable, robust, incredibly versatile, and they were creating all sorts of things from chamber pots to entire structures like conservatories. They were very successful at marketing themselves. They had extensive catalogues, and they had a very aggressive sales team who had really ambitious targets. And if they didn't meet them, they were let go. So the sales team were under huge pressure, and as a consequence, they were very successful. So here's a bigger picture of their Postle Park works, and you can see how enormous it is. All of the work sheds. You can see the showrooms at the very front. You can see the erecting yards at the back, and then the railway line at the very back, which would have brought in the raw goods and then brought out the finished goods. And they were making all sorts of things from urinals. I mentioned that cast iron was seen as a really hygienic material. So with the growing surge in the creation of public amenities, which was becoming increasingly important in Victorian times, cast iron was perfectly suited to this type of structure. In the days before running water, there were lots of philanthropic bequests of drinking fountains, for example, and cast iron again was perfectly suited to this, very robust, durable, and again seen as hygienic. and they could be super fancy with ornate canopies as well, and came in a range of sizes. And Walter Macfarlane was producing ironwork for an international market, and he was very successful at creating brochures for all sorts of international markets. So here's just a couple of examples. And here are some examples of the ironwork that was exported. So the top left is in Brazil, bottom left is in Malaysia, the middle one is a lighthouse in Brazil, the top right was a banking hall in India, and then the bottom right, which is slightly obscured, apologies, is a war memorial in South Africa. And again, you see how clever they were at producing such a range of materials. So you could buy a stock figure. You can see the guy, the soldier, up at the top of that memorial. So you could, they were selling stock figures that you could paint to look like bronze, to look like stone, to look lifelike, or to look like iron, whatever you wanted. So they were really successful at marketing themselves. But they hit tough times at the turn of the century. And there wasn't this desire for really ornate, fussy designs. So really from the start of the 20th century, these firms had to work hard to diversify and stay afloat. And firms like Macfarlane's moved into building facades, and you see a lot of these all over the UK. So this was what their showrooms and the front of their premises looked like back in the 19th century. And sadly, that was a picture taken back in 2006. That there was literally nothing left of the industrial complex, which is really sad. This was one of the most important iron founding firms in the world, really, a really important historical firm, and there's nothing left of their firm, which is really sad. But thankfully, plenty of their ironwork does survive, which is wonderful. Now, I'll just touch on one more firm. This is one of their main competitors, George Smith & Co. And again, a hugely successful firm. This guy, George Smith, he went bust. He sold the firm. Someone else pinched the name and kept using it when they weren't entitled to. All sorts of lawsuits. It's fascinating tracking the history of this firm and the name. But I don't have time to go into that today. But really interesting firm, very good at what they did. George Smith had actually started off working in Walter Macfarlane and then went and set up his own business. But what I really love about this firm is that they created utterly bonkers things like this fountain, which is A-listed, and you can still go and visit in Paisley. I really would strongly urge you to go and visit this fountain if you can. It's absolutely mad, absolutely gorgeous. And still very much loved by its community. But who would ever think of having life-size walruses? So I just love it for its sheer madness, but it's just gorgeous. And these extracts from the George Smith catalogue show how these types of structures were made. So they weren't all cast in one piece. It was a kit of parts that was put together. So you could pick which kind of putty or which type of heron or bird you wanted to fix to your fountain. You could pick the cast iron rocks or the cast iron icebergs, whichever you wanted, and put them together to form all sorts of different designs. And this fountain was refurbished a number of years ago, and the original colour scheme was reinstated, and it's absolutely adored by the local community. It's fabulous. Who couldn't love it? It's really, really, really lovely. So do go and see it if you get the chance. So that's a really quick look at some of the big firms producing architectural cast ironwork in the 19th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, because of this huge surge in mass production, and that went for other materials like ceramics, of course, there was a bit of a backlash against that. So you get the rise, for example, of the arts and crafts movement, which started to really have a revival in terms of appreciation of handcrafted and seeing the marks of the person that made the product. Now, anyone who has ever been to an iron foundry and seen a mold being produced actually gets an insight into how much skill it takes to produce a mold. It was a 4-year apprenticeship. So even mass producing cast iron, hugely, it's a complex process. Even from producing the patterns, takes a lot of skill. but you can mass produce items, whereas wrought iron all has to be individually shaped. So you start seeing a resurgence in wrought iron work. And I'm just going to touch on one firm which was really important at the start of the 20th century in Edinburgh. This was Thomas Hadden's firm. They were based in Edinburgh. They started off in Stockbridge and then moved to Murrayfield. What I like about this firm is you can really track the resurgence of style. So Thomas Hadden worked with artists and architects like Robert Lorimer, for example. He did a huge amount of work for Robert Lorimer and collaborated very closely. And so lots of Art Nouveau designs were created by his workshop in collaboration with Art Nouveau architects and designers. And Art Nouveau arts and crafts were all very influenced by medieval architecture and crafts, as well as 16th and 17th century. And you can really see this in Thomas Hadden's ironwork. He has a really distinctive style, and it's really fascinating looking at his ironwork because you can see the same motifs and designs cropping up in ironwork that he's produced for different designers. So clearly it was a collaborative process. So again, the ironwork is telling the story. So anyone who was paying attention at the start of my talk might recognize or see a similarity in the flower finial or terminal that you see on the left-hand side. His work and the designs of Robert Lorimer were very influenced by 17th century ironwork. But also medieval stuff, so you can see like this kind of wattle or basket weave in the kind of the central image, and you can spot Hadden's ironwork a mile off. So you see, for example, these owl finials and the little Tweety bird, the acorns. These are all really typical of his work. So just to give you a little reminder, this is the 17th century stuff. And here's a bit more of Thomas Hadden. So you can see how he's taking the motifs from the 17th century and together with other designers giving it a 20th century Art Nouveau twist. Absolutely superb. And you can see some of Thomas Hadden's ironwork in the National Museum on Chambers Street in Edinburgh. So that's me. That was a really quick introduction to traditional ironwork in Scotland. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to find out more, or if you have any ironwork that you would like to know how to look after or do repairs to, there are lots of resources, including a free short guide produced by Historic Environment Scotland, which you can access on our Engine Shed website. You can see the web link on the screen there. Other resources available through the National Heritage Ironwork Group, and I've just shown you a few pictures of some fantastic books that are worth taking a look at. Also, the Scottish Ironwork Foundation that I mentioned, you can access and search the database if you type that web link into your browser. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoy all of the other presentations and resources in the festival. And I hope you enjoy spotting lovely architectural ironwork in your own area as well. Thank you.